From a scientific standpoint, admirable works on colour have been written, but they demand more time and study than many can give to them, and are too theoretical to be easily understood, whilst those written from an artistic standpoint may be useful to those who paint pictures but are not of much benefit to larger classes of people who are artists in other occupations. Painters of pictures must study colour as well as lines and composition, but a better understanding of colour would also be of great value to decorators, designers, lithographers, florists, dressmakers and milliners, women in their dress and home decoration, and many others. That is a quote from Emily Noyes Vanderpoel's Colour Problems, a practical manual for the lay student of colour. Welcome to Stories in Colour, a podcast from the National Gallery in London, searching for histories of how colour has changed the world. In this episode, we're asking why, among many famous colour theorists and writers, so few we know today are women. We'll be telling the stories of some of these amazing women and the impact they've had on colour and indeed art history. I'm Bex Leary from the Digital Department here at the National Gallery, and I'm joined today by two guests, Dr. Alexandra Loske and Zeynep Sagir. Alexandra is a colour expert and art historian who is currently curator of the Royal Pavilion in Brighton. Her exhibition Colour, a Chromatic Promenade through the Royal Pavilion was on display in 2025. She's also author of The Artist's Palette and Colour, a Visual History. Zeynep is an artist, colour consultant and founder of the Colour Club. She holds a master's degree from Central St Martin's and spent 2 years researching colour psychology. Since graduating, she's gone on to become a certified colour consultant and colour therapist. And through the Colour Club, Zeynep runs workshops, hosts events and offers consultancy, as well as publishing articles and interviews. Very big welcome back, both of you, to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. I can't wait to get into the stories of all these amazing women, but we do need to set the scene to think about the canon of literature on colour from the earlier times, from the 19th and earlier 20th century. But we should start right back when with Isaac Newton. So we've had an audience question, which normally we end an episode with, but we're going to start this episode with an audience question. So one of our YouTube subscribers said that they'd like to know more about how a progressive understanding of physics of light and optics influenced colour theory, and Isaac Newton feels like a great place to start to answer that. So who was Newton and why was his work in colour theory so significant?
Starting with Newton, early 1700s, he used a prism to show that white light isn't just plain white. It's made up of all the colors of the spectrum. And he passed a beam of light through a prism and saw it split into a rainbow. And then he used a second prism to recombine it back into white light. And that was revolutionary. And it proved that color comes from the light itself. And the idea is color is physical and measurable property of light. And a few decades later, we get Moses Harris, and he wasn't a scientist like Newton. He was an artist and naturalist, and he took Newton's theory and made it visual. And around 1760s, he developed one of the first color wheels based on primary colors, red, blue, and yellow, and show how they could mix into secondary and tertiary hues, creating a whole system of harmony. And his color wheel was about practical use. It was helpful for artists, painters, even decorators to understand how to use color effectively.
So what is a colour wheel? What does that look like, Alexandra?
Well, of course, Newton turned his famous experiments with prisms not just into a great writing and the book that eventually comes out in 1704 called Optics. Makes it very clear it's about coloured light, so not about painters' colours. But he goes one step further. He wants to make it visually. He tries to find a representation of colour order. And he gives us not the very first, but one of the earliest colour wheels. And we don't know why he turned the spectrum into a wheel, but he did. And it remains, to this day, one of the most popular representations in a geometrical form of colour concepts.
What would one look like?
Well, Newton's was a perfect circle with a center of gravity at the center. And then he divided it into what he decided on were the 7 colors of the visible spectrum.
Okay. And then we've touched on Moses Harris. We then get Goethe, don't we, as the next kind of
coming in the early 1800s, a total shift in thinking. And he didn't agree with Newton at all. And he thought Newton's experiments were too mechanical and didn't account for how we see and feel color. And he explored how color is influenced by contrast, light, and even psychological perception. And for Goethe, color wasn't just a scientific fact, it was a human experience as well.
And are there any artists who've been particularly inspired by, I guess, Newton in particular, Alexandra, and that we could see in the National Gallery?
So the interesting is that Newton comes in with his publication at the beginning of the 18th century.
Yes.
So we have sort of 2 worlds here. We're in the age of enlightenment. We're in the great age of reason and of trying to understand the world and classifying everything. So there's all these scientific advantages happening and mechanical, and we go up in a hot air balloon for the first time in that century. But then there's also, as Zeynep said, another sort of strand to this, another take on it, and some of it is anti-Newtonian, and that is, how do we feel about it, and how do we think about it, how do we respond to, in this case, color. And that, of course, is reflected in painting, especially in landscape painting, which really comes into its own. So in landscape painting, we see artists both being very serious in observation. So, you have to have good observational skills and make lots of notes and go to the right lectures and learn about optics and meteorology. But you also have the picturesque aspect of how beautiful it looks or is supposed to look and what emotions it might trigger. And someone like John Constable, is a person who really beautifully combines it both. So he's very accurate in his sort of depictions of nature, of especially the sky, but he uses it to create an atmosphere, to tell a story.
Absolutely. So we've talked about some male colour theorists, but there were also colour men, weren't they? What's different about colour men compared to colour theorists? Why are they called colour men?
Colour men were colour experts who made and sold paints. And the term comes from the time when trades mostly were run by men, around 18th, 19th century. And I can give some examples like George Field, for example, one of the most respected colour men of his time, because he didn't just sell pigments, he studied their chemical properties. He studied how to make paints last and also look good together. And also he wrote about how colors work together in a way that was clear and useful, not just scientific. And I think it was really inspirational for that time. And then I can say another colour man, Michel-Eugène Chevreul. He was a French chemist, and he also explored how to combine colors that look good together.
And some had shops. I think there was one not far from the National Gallery.
Really?
Actually, when the National Gallery was founded,
1824.
We had just had the big anniversary, of course. So in St. Martin's Lane, there was one. Okay. We know that because there's a beautiful picture by George Scharf, and that was Thomas Allen. So he was a colour man who also had a shop. So he didn't just make artists' tools and pigments, he also sold them in a shop.
And George Field also was working in London, was he? He was British?
Yeah.
Yes. And some famous artists would have been working with him or getting paint from him?
I'm not sure exactly who, but I know that Michel-Eugène Chevreul in the shop, he was exploring how colors affecting each other when placed side by side.
Yeah.
And his theory was about how colors can change the appearance of another. Yes. And that idea affected many artists, like neo-impressionist artists like Seurat.
Yes.
And to come back to the George Field question, we know, because he was very keen, as you say, on producing good quality pigments that would last, that would be, light fast and so on. We know that the pre-Raphaelite painters were very keen on having excellent pigments, and that results in the brilliance of a lot of pre-Raphaelite paintings, but also Sir Thomas Lawrence, who I think requested a particular red from George Field. So on the whole, you don't see George Field. Few people know about him, but you see his work. You see the great colour man's work in the things he made for artists.
I think Turner as well used supplies from Field.
Yes, and Constable actually knew him, so he had exchanges with George Field, the great colour man.
We've talked about some of the men who've been very influential in colour theory and pigments, but where do we start to see women colour theorists coming in?
Well, that's the big question, and I'm sure you've had the same experience. I mean, I've been researching colour for 16, 17 years now, and I think all these men are great. They're absolutely fascinating writers, artists, scientists. But I did wonder, where are the women?
Yes.
What role did they play? Because I kept seeing them as personifications, as allegories. There is, of course, the great Kaufmann painting of colour as an allegorical figure of a woman. So where were the women? Well, they're really hard to find because they did not have the same opportunities, and their names weren't as well recorded, their work wasn't recorded. But they are around. You just need to dig, and you need to persevere, and you need to go sort of scratch the surface, really, and then you will find them.
And is there a point in history at which we start seeing more work by women on colour theory and colour? Or is it? Is there so few throughout the whole of history?
There is so little material that I personally have spread my net really widely. So I include them all, even the ones that we wouldn't call colour theorists. So if a woman in the late 19th century in America writes a school primer for children on colour, then I consider her to have a place in the history of colour. She doesn't need to be a colour theorist. And there are all these invisible women who come before we have more evidence in print, who we'll never know the names of. And I'll just give you one example. It's the great Cennino Cennini, who, of course, writes Il Libro dell'Arte, the great book on art and painting, in 1500, I think. First translated by a woman, by Mary Field. Second translation also by a woman, Christiana Herringham. But this is what he says. This is the only time he mentions women in this. He says, when you're making ultramarine, the pigment, it should be an occupation for pretty girls rather than men, for they are always at home and reliable, and they have more dainty hands. Just beware of old women. So
goodness,
so they have dainty hands, so they can make this beautiful pigment, and they should. But this gets you thinking about all those women who worked in the background, who may have been scraping off the lead white to make lead white pigment, and got poisoned in the process, and the women who kept on filtering and kneading the blue pigment.
Because we think of artists' workshops in the Renaissance and beyond as being, full of men. And I had no idea that
there will have been a lot of women doing certain work. But there's also, of course, if you think about the great, great history of illustrated books and hand-coloured plates, especially in the 18th century, but it's also still in the 19th century. And we know that a lot of these plates, not necessarily related to colour literature, were hand-coloured by women or even young girls.
Amazing. And do we know roughly how many texts were written or published by women, I guess, prior to like the 20th century or so?
It's hard to pin down a number, but I have gone meticulously with highlighters and markers through Roy Osborne's continually developing sort of a bibliography of colour books published. And I've come to a rough figure of about 20 women before 1900 who published books on colour. So these are only the ones who published. They're not the ones who work in workshops and whatever. Roughly 20, and that includes the fabulous Philadelphia Merrifield and all her transcriptions and translations. So it's shockingly few. And
geographically, how far does that bibliography spread?
As far as possible, but of course it is, because Roy works in this country, of course it is sort of focused on mainly the Western world.
20. That's so few. But I'm so excited to get into some of the stories of these women. We will come back after the break and we will introduce some of them to our listeners. Hi, it's Bex from the future here. I have a quick note about the next section about colour theorist Martha Gartside. Since the time of the episode's recording, our guest, Alexandra Loske, has done some stellar detective work and uncovered that Gartside's first name was in fact Martha, not Mary. So you're going to hear us say Mary a whole lot, but please remember it's actually Martha Gartside. We've added a link to the story of this amazing discovery in the episode's show notes. Now, back to the show. Welcome back from the break. We are going to get into the stories now of the amazing women who've had an impact on colour theory, colour history. So let's dive now into the brilliant Mary Gartside. How did you first come across her and who was she?
Well, I was doing a lot of research into colour theory in the early 19th century, because I'm based at the Royal Pavilion and that was my PhD research project. And there were all these amazing men, Moses Harris, Goethe, of course, later Chevreul, George Field. And I thought, God, there must have been women. And I looked at the books of the time, and it was actually Neil Parkinson from the Colour Reference Library at the Royal College of Art in London who said, there was a woman. Why don't you look into her? She looks amazing. And this is Mary Gartside, a flower painter, a teacher of painting in watercolour, again, two other women, probably aristocratic women. And she also had the support of an aristocratic woman, Lady Sophia Gray. And she goes beyond being able to teach. She writes about colour and publishes, and it's absolutely phenomenal because this happens in 1805. And just to put that into context, that is 5 years before Goethe's substantial work on colour, Die Farbenlehre, zur Farbenlehre. And she is absolutely phenomenal with her approach to a colour theory. And she calls it a colour theory in the second edition. So she's a fantastic example, a real trailblazer.
Was she able to have any formal training at this time? Would women have been able to have formal training in this field, or is she self-taught?
We don't know. There's very, very little information on her. Usually when women make it into a usually male-dominated field, it is within what they were allowed to do, what was possible for them. So painting in watercolour is fine. Painting in oil, not so much for women at the time.
Okay.
Flower painting rather than going on a grand tour, for example. So everything is done on a smaller scale. And a lot of these women, including Angelica Kauffmann, of course, had the support from fathers or brothers. We don't know in the case of Mary Gartside. She was from the north of England, clearly had some training. Women did get training or a sort of education in painting, watercolour. But to then turn this into a teaching position is quite something. And to also make it down to London, and we're talking the 1780s, and exhibit at the Royal Academy as an honorary exhibitor. And of course they are flower paintings. But then to make that big step to publishing, and publishing at such a sophisticated book. So she also gives us, she references the great names in colour literature to date. So she has read Moses Harris, and Moses Harris's first edition is an extraordinarily rare book, yet she had somehow access to it. I don't think she owned it, but she had access to it, probably through the Royal Academy. She probably knew James Sowerby, again, through the interest in plants, and she's also sometimes described as a botanist, certainly has a great knowledge of flowers, and she's involved with several botanical gardens. And she gives us color charts, hand painted. She also gives us a color wheel, which is fascinating and relates and refers to Newton. But then she further illustrates her theory, and it's essentially a painting manual with 8 completely abstract, freely painted blots. So they're basically works of art.
They look like abstract works of art almost, don't they?
They are. She never uses the word abstract, but she says these are something along the lines of these are basically chromatic layouts of how you should compose a painting. And in this case, a bunch of flowers or flower still life. And once you know that, you go, my goodness, this is actually really maybe the beginning of abstract art.
Could you describe what they look like to us? I think it's almost hard to imagine, isn't it? What a blot is.
And I've had them looked. I mean, I've been looking at them for 15 years and I've comparing all the different editions. But I've also had them looked at by a paper conservator who knows about how paintings are created, and it's basically several layers of transparent watercolor with a little bit of gouache, but there's a lot of thinking in that because where it says, and it goes roughly through Newton's spectrum, roughly. But she starts with white, which is also fascinating that she includes white as a color. Also possibly a reference to Newton. So when she says, here's the orange blot, it's of course not just orange, it's also the contrast. So there's also the colors that should be combined with orange. So in the orange blot, you have a lot of blue, for example. Mm-hmm. That's, of course, a complementary color. So is she maybe even for predating Chevreul's laws of simultaneous contrast? So it is phenomenally important work, which of course was not included in the so-called color canon until very, very recently. It took until well into the 20th century until she was actually mentioned in critical literature.
And these blots are sort of like almost clouds of color, aren't they? They because of the how watercolor works on the paper, they almost run into sort of very organic feeling shapes. There's lots of roundness to it. There's no sharp lines. So the orange one that you're referring to, there's oranges and sort of very pale blues and then a really intense dark blue. And then in the middle, you get the kind of perhaps the combination between the orange and the blue, which is a sort of ruddy, brownish, purplish colour in the middle.
And if you then think about flowers, okay, then she places a blue flower here and a yellow flower and an orange flower there. But then once you start walking through a gallery and look at paintings from that same period, you suddenly realize how people generally were thinking about color. And you see something like that on a much, much bigger scale in some of Turner's paintings. I'm not suggesting Turner read her. I doubt that he did. You may have heard of her, but he wouldn't never have admitted to being inspired by Mary Gartside. But we have very similar color combinations. And I don't know, Zeynep, do you want to describe what's in the book? So apart from the really useful text, how is it illustrated?
So I think Mary Gartside's blots were revolutionary. And I think her approach was so intensive. She was not theorizing about colors. She was painting it. And when I look at the blots, it's not about the details. It's not about like theory. It's about the feelings. And it's really impressive for me that obviously I'm from Turkey and I didn't even realize about women color theories. And last year, luckily, I had a chance to know about Mary Gartside thanks to Alexandra. And I realized that before knowing about her, I was looking at paintings at the galleries, always by men. And I felt that now I'm seeing the whole picture and I'm seeing famous paintings and I can see the effect that she created. It's so impressive for me. And to see it's about the feeling and when I look at the time, that's happening. It's very impressive. It's very intelligent. When I look at Turner's paintings, generally, I can see a similarity in approach to her. And for example, when I look at that painting and when I look at them together, here I can see the light, I can see the blur, I can see the mood. But it's not about details, it's about the feeling, as if like they both explore how color can speak. It's really impressive.
So we're looking at JMW Turner's very famous painting in the National Gallery, The Fighting Temeraire from 1839, and is full of these complementary colours, isn't it? The oranges and the blues, and then also the whites. And I love the synergy that you're drawing here in how Mary is theorising colour through her blots and the artistic practice of Turner. Are there any other works? Is it Turner generally that you feel this synergy with her work?
Personally, I can say Turner, and because like when you look at really big canvases, I'm looking at the skies, and like nearly all of the paintings done by Turner, I feel the same feeling. I'm not looking at the composition. I'm not looking at the details. And when I look at Turner's paintings, the first thing I'm thinking about the mood of the painting. That's what I'm feeling when I look at Martha Gartside's blots. And the other thing I'm really impressed, watercolor doesn't accept mistakes. It's amazing how she did this, like as if there is no mistake and everything is like planned. But when you paint with watercolor, obviously you feel that you are open to mistakes. But here, when I look at it, it's perfectly done. It's really impressive.
Fantastic.
Of course, then we're in the realm of more invisible women, because this kind of book with 8 hand color freely painted blots plus a color wheel plus color charts, you can imagine even if the print run was as low as 100, you end up with thousands of plates that need to be painted. So it's impossible that she would have done that herself. And from what we can glean from a sort of certain other literature and advertisements is that she probably engaged her students, so other young women, and she looked over their shoulders, and she was, and they were illustrating her books under her immediate eye.
Wow.
Yeah, that was for the second edition. So that's quite extraordinary. So it goes into a second edition in 1808, and then it's called A New Theory of Colour. So she puts in the word theory, which is fantastic. And that's still 2 years before Goethe.
Could you summarise for us why you think she was so radical and inventive?
Well, I think she was radical and inventive because she had to cut through the noise to actually make it. So in the first edition, she had the support of another woman. So it's something like this needs to be underwritten.
Remind us.
This is Lady Sophia Gray,
Yes.
possibly one of her students. It's an aristocratic woman, and that was pretty standard. So we also mustn't forget what we see, what actually is still around, even not in great quantities. There tended to be privileged women already. So we'll never know about these invisible underprivileged women. But so it's published as a painting manual supported by a woman. And then we don't know how many copies were printed. And then in 1808, and this is really fascinating, she gets a proper publisher, William Miller, and he produces a second edition. The blots are slightly different, but there's also more explanation of the blots in the text. But crucially, it says part 1. Flowers. And then the publisher informs her that part 2 would have been landscapes. I would love to have seen Martha Gartside break down a landscape painting into its chromatic, abstract components. And that's what makes her phenomenal, that she had that concept of abstract art and breaking something down into the chromatic layout.
So a full century before abstract expressionism existed, with artists like Vasily Kandinsky, Kazimir Malevich, Pierre Mondrian, she is doing something.
She's doing that.
Very similar.
She's doing that. Yeah.
Fantastic. This is a good time for us to take a break, and we will dive forward through some more women colour theorists and writers after the break. Welcome back from the break. So we're going to go forward in time a little now to look at Emily Noyes Vanderpoel, 1842 to 1939, whose work we quoted at the start of the episode. So Zeynep, can you tell us a bit more about Emily?
Emily Noyes Vanderpoel, one of my favorites. She was an American artist and color theorist, and she was one of the people to study color in a very careful and organized way. And in her book, Colour Problems, she broke everyday objects into small squares of solid colors and placing them in grids. And each grid show how color work together like perfectly and how they balance. And it's very intelligent. And when I look at it, I think she showed us color is a language all its own. And when I look at it without reading, obviously, the titles, numbers, it looks so systematic, planned, organized. But when you look at the title and you start to imagine the object, and it's so impressive to see the object, it's kind of abstract.
It's like a 10 by 10 grids of squares, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's another form of abstraction, really. So breaking it down to color components. And what are the objects? Because she was a collector of many.
Like antique rock.
Yeah.
Again, antique rock. It's like flowers.
I think there's a mummy cloth in there somewhere, isn't there?
Eggshell plate. And then, obviously, we can see more abstract version of the objects. And that's, again, so like, I think revolutionary. And before all these men we are talking about for abstract art, I think it's very, very extraordinary to see that how she is visualizing that materials, objects into abstract version.
What mediums was she using for the squares, the grid, and then could you describe to us some of the other kind of forms that she's painting in here?
As I know, she used watercolors.
Well, in the originals, yes, but now we're now just in the 20th century, and that is, you asked earlier about a big change in when do we see more women, and I would really, for me, it's the turn from the 19th to the 20th century, and that's to do with book production and, you know, other forms of illustration. This is lithography, but it's high quality lithography, and it's really interesting how it's quite a small book, no hand colouring anymore, we've passed that, so this is so good, by now reliable colour reproductions, but it's really thick, slightly textured paper, and there's more illustrations than pages of text, although the text is very good and very neat and very informed. And then really her focus is on these, I want to call them concepts, really.
Yeah.
So how do you explain the chromatic makeup of an object, and whether it's a rug or a mummy cloth or a vase, she wants us to understand how these, as you say, how they speak to each other, the language of color. But it's not just that. She also uses circles. She's completely on top of what else is going on in the color world. So she uses the Milton Bradley, this is America, of course, color machine. And then she follows it with something that looks a bit like Gartside. And some people thought maybe she knew of Gartside. I doubt Gartside had made it over to the United States by then, but there are sort of color notes, and this is sort of nature, the color of nature. So if you look at what's this one? This is just one example. This is
so we've got the book in the studio that we're having a look at here. And a bluebird, did you say?
A bluebird, but it's not a picture of a bluebird, it's the colours of a bluebird.
So we've got this sort of very organic shape of a kind of tealy dark blue, a dark grey and a dark brown.
And again, looks a bit like a colour blot. She calls it a colour note, but it's the same principle. Make a quick note of what you see colour-wise, and then you understand how something works. Turner did something similar, just about 100 years earlier. I think he called them colour beginnings, but it is that idea of just focusing on the colour.
And so for the grid ones, how would that work? So, for example, I think you said there was one of a rug. How would he break down a rug into the grid or another example?
Good question. Nowadays you would have an app. How did Vanderpoel do it? I think she just had a really good eye, didn't she? She could literally take it apart.
Yeah. As I know, for the abstract ones, she first
These are the more organic ones, not the grids.
Yeah. She used for this ones like watercolor is keeping a diary. And I think for the grid ones, again, once I think you used to keep the diary of the visuals, I think she knew it. Like her eye maybe, just did all the maths, and she was directly reflecting the objects into grids, I guess.
I guess they could almost prefigure our idea of pixels, can't they? They're sort of like
very good.
The little kind of cubes on a screen, but here far before that, obviously, in a book. Fantastic. And her book is interactive in some sense as well. Am I right in thinking?
It is. She included, so there's lots of other scales. I mean, it's more than 100 illustrations on this really good quality paper. And she included what I think is celluloid, early celluloid, sort of coloured strips of celluloid.
So translucent, sort of plastically looking overlays.
That's what early film was shot on, wasn't it? So we have a yellow one, we have a blue one, and we have a colour wheel, transparent colour wheel, which can be placed on the colour wheel on the plate or several plates in the book. So they rarely survive. It's very few copies left. But recently, I think in 2018, a beautiful, almost facsimile reprint was published of this book.
And would she have thought of herself as primarily an artist? Would she have thought of herself as a scientist? What do you know what she would have thought of herself as, or
I think predominantly an educator, an educator, and she was very, very supportive of women. And she was a great champion of better education for women and access to further education.
Amazing. So that was Emily Noyes Vanderpoel. And now we'll have a look at Caroline or Carrie Van Biema?
Van Biema.
Thank you.
I think that's how you pronounce it.
Who lived from 1881 to 1942, for whom also colour was a passion.
Yes, in a way, not too dissimilar to Mary Gartside or actually Emily Noyes Vanderpoel, an artist as well as an educator, so a teacher on art, and but also clearly very keen on writing on the written word. Carrie Van Biema came from a well-to-do, very arty and supportive Dutch, German, Jewish family. And she just followed her passions, which was, I guess, they're our passions. So colour, teaching about it, talking about it, writing about it. I'm not an artist, but she was. So in 1930, she brings out this book, which I did wonder why I hadn't heard of it until about 10 years ago. It looks absolutely gorgeous. Published in Germany, and it is called Farben und Formen als lebendige Kräfte, and that sort of translates as colors and shapes or forms as powerful living forces. And for anyone who knows a little bit about Expressionism, German Expressionism, you'll understand that this is really the time when colour is considered a powerful expressive force. So she taps into this, and she's sort of in that sort of avant-garde scene in Germany. She goes to Munich. I think she does meet Johannes Itten, later of Bauhaus, of course. And so she brings out this beautiful book, and it's a really solid book on colour, on the history of colour theory. So there's one part on the history of colour theory, and then there's one section on her teacher's colour theory, Adolf Hölzel, another artist who never published. And there's a third of the book is devoted to Johann Wolfgang von Goethe.
Okay.
And it's just really solid. It's really good. It also has interactive elements with these overlays over her plates. Again, very complex color wheels, color diagrams, but also examples from art. And then you have a transparent overlay, which then gives you the language aspect of it, the label, so to speak. So it's great. And I thought, well, why don't we know more about her? And the story is really tragic because Carrie Van Biema, with her great awareness of the importance of history and the greatness of aspects of German art, and particularly of Goethe, being of Jewish background, she was one of those victims of the Holocaust. And in 1930, Carrie Van Biema published Farben und Formen als lebendige Kräfte. She enjoys its success, and I have a copy here in front of me, which always makes me well up because I just bought one of the few remaining copies and I ordered it from Canada. And it's inscribed by her, and it is inscribed. It was inscribed in July 1932 in Weimar, which is of course where Goethe lived, and this is 100 years. The 100th anniversary of Goethe's death. So there were all these people gathering, celebrating Goethe and the greatness of his work. And there's even some pictures of all these people celebrating Goethe. And then a few years later, of course, Germany descends into darkness, and Van Biema tries to hide. She goes to the Netherlands, to various places in the Netherlands, goes into hiding, but eventually gets taken to Westerbork camp and then from there to Auschwitz and is immediately murdered at Auschwitz.
Goodness, what a tragic end to a fantastic woman's life.
And not understanding that this book is actually celebrating German culture. So, and it's very likely that the book was also burnt in one of the,
in the book
burnings of the German. But, we are celebrating it now. And again, a reprint was produced a few years ago. Very few copies remain, probably because a lot of them were destroyed. So the 2 copies I know have both came from America, clearly taken to America by people who got away.
Goodness. And is there somewhere we can visit a memorial for her today?
There is. So basically I'm working on her, and there's also a great scholar in the Netherlands who works on her. And what we have managed, what has now been done is there is this relatively new tradition of putting little brass plaques into the ground. They're called Stolpersteine. So you're meant to stop. Not literally trip over them, but stop, and they have the names of victims of the Nazis inscribed on them. And there is now one, I believe it's in Utrecht, because she was in so many places at the end, but that now exists. And I'm writing about her. I'm teaching about her. I mention her in every lecture I give on women in colour history.
Perhaps both of you could tell us one thing about her that you just find so powerful about her work, and we can help her live on.
I can say, luckily, I have that book as well. And sadly, because it's German, I cannot understand. And all I know from, again, everything about her from Alexandra. And even, obviously, it's German. And when I look at the images there, it gives me the feeling that she is with the diagrams on the book, as if she used that diagrams to explore the deeper meaning of visual experience. And that's what I feel when I look at the diagrams.
Yeah. There's a lot of similarities to Vanderpoel, I think, in her approach, the analytical, but also a real deep understanding of colour.
Yeah, it's like they both use geometry, simplicity. It's like as if color and form could speak for themselves. And it's really amazing, yeah.
That's beautiful. We have time to touch on just maybe a couple more names, perhaps particularly, Zeynep, you could talk to us about Bonnie Snow.
Yeah, I would love that. Bonnie Snow was an American art educator and author who worked in early 1900s. And she's not as famous as people like Newton or Goethe, but she did a big impact in teaching color theory. And she tried to make the color theory easy to understand for everyone, like students, art teachers, designers, artists, even beginners. And together with Hugo Freilich, they wrote a book called The Theory and Practice of Color in 1918. And the book perfectly explains how colors work together. And the key idea was how to combine colors that look good together. That's what we call color harmony. And to teach color harmony, it's amazing that she used color wheels, hue relationships, volume scales, and they're all hand painted.
They're still hand painted, then cut out in little circles or little strips and glued individually into this book.
Beautiful.
That's really amazing book to read, I guess.
And Alexandra, there's actually a woman who's got a link with the National Gallery as well.
Yes, the fabulous Mrs. Merrifield, Mary Philadelphia Merrifield, who is he's born the year before Gartside first publishes. So she's a real Victorian. And she spends most of her life in Brighton. I didn't know that when I first came across her.
Being from
Brighton, being a curator there. But so she was a sort of colour collector. She had a lot of, again, no formal education, no formal higher education, but a lot of support from her family. And a great network, and clearly very bright, very intelligent. And like a lot of women in the 19th century, she learns a lot. She acquires knowledge and expertise through carefully observing, keep going to galleries and keep reading and so on. And she starts collecting colour treatises and translating them. So she is the first who translated Cennino Cennini's Il Libro dell'Arte, which had just come out in 1821. So she translates it into English, and then at some point she secures funding from Charles Locke Eastlake and other people, and the Prime Minister, I think, to go on a journey or several journeys to the continent, to predominantly Italy, but she also skims Paris and Germany. And she collects and transcribes and then translates Renaissance treatises, so older treatises on colour manuscripts. And they're still, I've been told, they're still being used by conservators today to understand painting techniques of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance.
Amazing. And so she brought that back into the English language, and
yes, so she captured that. She captured that knowledge. Of course, there's a great interest in the 19th century in sort of medieval and Renaissance art, as we see in the National Gallery.
Yes, of course.
So she taps into that and works in a field where she can work, and that only works because she is supported by her husband. And she can't travel on her own. It's the 1840s when she travels. And she writes lovely, fascinating letters. And she has to take one of her sons with her to be able to travel.
An escort, is that what you would describe it as?
Yeah.
And so the connection there with the National Gallery is that Sir Charles Locke Eastlake, when the gallery's administration was restructured in 1855, became our very first director. So the head of the National Gallery. And so it's lovely to have that.
I think some of her manuscripts are actually here in the Charles Locke Eastlake Library in the National Gallery. So her actual transcriptions. Not all of them were done, but some were done. She got her sons working.
Very good. Those are all the women we have time to discuss in detail today. But there are, of course, many more that we're discovering. Though there are few, there are many more. And there's ongoing research, which you're both involved in. But Alexandra, could you tell us a bit about the ongoing research that's happening around?
Yes, well, I'm sort of working apart from my day job as a curator. This is what really remained for me the most fascinating part of my work in colour. I want to find those women. I'm working on a library of colour women. I've got a small research sort of space, shall we say, at the University of Sussex, so that is continuing, and I'm networking with a lot of people on that subject, such as Zeynep. So I want to continue this, and it's nice how this sort of goes on now, or inspires other people. Just had an inquiry from the United States where somebody wants to create a corpus of all known copies of Gartside's works and digitize all the blots and make that available.
That would be fantastic. Mm-hmm. That would be absolutely amazing. Well, that brings us to the end of today's episode on women colour theorists. Thank you so much, both of you, Zeynep, Alexandra, for joining us today.
Pleasure.
If you listening have got more questions about the story of colour in art and culture and history, you can email us. We're on podcast@nationalgallery.org.uk, or you can send in questions via our social media channels. Just mention the podcast and we'll try and answer some of those for you in our next series of Stories in Colour. So huge thank you to today's guests, Dr. Alexandra Loske and Zeynep Sagir. I've been your host, Bex Leary. Our producer was Harry Rosehill. Our researcher was Hannah Rogers. Our technicians were Ian Warren and Tom Gulliver. Our video editor was Jeanne Kenyon. And with thanks to our scientific team at the National Gallery. Thank you to you for listening.